Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us, for inviting HCD down. Jose Ayala, Senior Housing Policy Specialist with the Department of Housing and Community Development. I'll do a quick presentation, really just answering a couple questions, and then hopefully the format lends itself a little bit better to a Q&A, so happy to answer any questions once I go through this real quick. Quick overview, what is HCD, who is HCD, talk about RENA, then we'll touch on Project Home Key. So what is HCD? Our mission statement, you can see it here, but providing stable, safe homes affordable to veterans, seniors, young families, farm workers, tribes, persons with disabilities, individuals, and families experiencing homelessness. So that is what we do. How we do that is through kind of 6 bullets here. So increasing the supply of affordable places to live, preserving affordable homes, protecting mobile homes and manufactured homeowners, building codes and standards, compliance with California plans for planning for housing, and then policy and research. So pretty much every activity that HCD does falls into one of these buckets here. So our department, it's about 1,300 people. We obviously have kind of the internal administration, we have our internal legal, financial divisions. But I think what I wanted to highlight here is, depending who you are, you might be talking about HCD a little bit differently. So I was at the nonprofit housing conference a couple weeks back that was held in San Francisco, and to a lot of folks there in the room, HCD is, state financial assistance and federal financial assistance, providing the dollars for projects. My unit, the Land Use and Local Government Relations unit, is housed in the Housing Policy Development Division. So we do planning grants, accountability and enforcement, housing elements, and then the last kind of external division that HCD has is codes and standards. So updating codes, titling mobile homes, things of that nature. So depending on who you are, what you do, HCD might look a little bit different to you. Also, that number 1,300, when I started about 4 years ago, was about 800. So we've ramped up pretty significantly in the last couple years, again, due to housing being, a priority. So understanding RENA, and apologies for the different slide templates. I thought this one was a little bit more up what we needed here, so I didn't transfer kind of the format over. But essentially, RENA projection of the additional housing units that regions, local jurisdictions need. It is a planning requirement and a building target, but it is not a prediction of building permit, construction, or housing activity. Really, the way I think about it is setting the framework for housing to come in. The RENA allocations look a little bit different depending where you are in the state. Most places, most urban places at least, are going to be kind of in that first category where HCD, in conjunction with the Department of Finance, they come up with a number, they hand it off to the Council of Governments. Here that will be ABAG, and then ABAG comes up with a methodology to assign those housing units to the different localities. So looks a little bit different depending on where you're at. In the state, some places, I came from San Diego, they emphasized jobs and transit in their allocation. So jurisdictions with more jobs and more transit would get more housing. So every location, every region in the state is going to be different. And then this last bucket to the right here is really for kind of those more rural jurisdictions. So think of your far north counties who might not have a council of government. HCD kind of acts as their issues out the determination for those jurisdictions. Just a couple points here on some of the statutory objectives. I think climate and equity at the center of kind of the RENA numbers. I won't go through every point here, but I think the important ones, for me at least, are the affirmatively furthering fair housing. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Balancing disproportionate household income distributions, really looking at the mix of housing in maybe some areas that don't have, lower income housing and higher income neighborhoods. I'm thinking, some, like for instance, I worked on the Pleasanton housing element. They're pretty high income, so they received an additional allocation for lower income RHNA based on kind of their numbers. Jobs, housing fit, promoting infill development, those are all kind of targets and goals of RHNA. What changed this cycle? I didn't really do the fifth cycle, so I don't know kind of the reasons why and the reasons behind kind of the difference, but I think that number, 2.5 million homes, if you've heard that, that was the key and driving force for the increase in the higher RHNA. So you'll see that some jurisdictions from the fifth cycle to this current cycle got some significantly higher housing targets to plan for. Fair housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, was another new requirement that came in the sixth cycle. Looking at site selection, there was a higher threshold for evidence and work that needed to be done to support and show the potential for development on those sites. And I think the goal is that every compliant housing element will have a better chance of actually producing housing than in previous cycles. So that's that. This next slide just really looking at housing elements is more than the paper exercise that it might have been in the past. Looking at having that be kind of your set of commitments to the state that you will execute programs that you say you will execute. In reviewing kind of past housing elements, a lot of programs just weren't fully accomplished or fully achieved. So we have a kind of a higher threshold for getting those commitments done and executed. And with all that new requirements, I think one thing that came out of the legislature and what HCD did was really provide the framework for grant programs. So the number there says $400 million in planning grants straight to local jurisdictions. Those would be kind of your SB2, your LEAP grants. Those were funding straight to cities. And I did a quick look. More than half of the cities used it specifically for their housing element update. And I'd say a good majority used it for kind of housing element adjacent actions. So rezoning, relooking at development standards. That was a lot of work conducted in those planning grants. Thousands of hours of technical assistance. I think one thing that hopefully comes across in housing element reviews and interactions with HCD is we're always willing and happy to have conversations on how can we help, what needs to be done to get over the finish line. That's something that hopefully comes across in our interactions with local jurisdictions. I think personally that's one of the things that I've been more passionate about is breaking down that barrier from kind of this big state agency and really trying to streamline those conversations between state agency and local jurisdictions. And lastly, two more things, sorry. The REAP 2.0 is kind of the more recent grant program, $600 million in planning and implementation grants. That's more regional focused. There was also a REAP 1.0, had similar goals, and I think it was also about $250 million. So a lot of money going out from the legislature through HCD to regions and local jurisdictions to help with all these planning efforts. And Home Key, which I don't work on personally, so I'm not too well versed on this one. I know the general kind of themes of it. So here's some kind of facts, and there's a Home Key email, which I think if you have specific questions that I can answer, that would be your spot to go and ask those questions there. We're currently in the third round of funding. This current pot, $736 million. That last bullet point is really for the acquisition and or rehab of motels, hotels, apartments, looking at housing folks and housing folks quickly. The geographic allocation for the Bay Area region, $111 million, and some specific set-asides for homeless youth, rural jurisdictions, and then the discretionary is really, if certain regions are oversubscribed and they were competitive applications, that's where that discretionary funding can maybe go beyond that 111 to the Bay Area region. So I talked quite a bit. I talked pretty fast. I just, for the life of me, can't slow down, but here's my contact info and then a couple websites. Happy to chat and answer any questions. Yep.
Just a quick question. I want to I think I heard you say that one of the big changes this time around was that there was going to be more need for real evidence that sites identified for housing were actually practical. So did you say something like that? And could you say a little more about what that additional evidence would constitute?
Yeah. So it's going to look different based on reliance on that specific site. It's going to look different based on kind of development standards, where that site's located. But generally speaking, when a city or a county is identifying sites in their housing element, we ask a lot more questions than we have in the past. So are there existing uses there? Is that, for example, is it like the one I always go to, is it like a strip mall or something like that, where you have maybe half are vacant and then the other half have leases that are ending in the next couple years? Well, that lends itself a little bit more to redevelopment than a fully leased out strip mall. Some spots, I know mall redevelopment is another key one in some cities where they're saying, well, retail is kind of dying and the mall's we don't need the parking on the mall that we used to. The anchor stores are going away, so we're looking at redeveloping these sites. Leases, again, is important there. The improvement to land value ratio, so is the land worth more than the improvements? That suggests that there is potential for redevelopment. I can kind of drone on and on about different, yeah.
In cases where there's a specific owner, some sort of ownership of the property, is it ever, do we have to consider if that owner is at all interested in selling and redeveloping?
Yeah, definitely. That's a component of it. And it doesn't always have to be, we have owner interest, we want to, if you don't have owner interest, that doesn't mean that the site doesn't have potential, because we are looking at 8 years out. So the owner might not have interest today in the first year or before the planning period starts, but maybe 4 years down the road, the conditions are still there for redevelopment. I kind of think of it as a slam dunk. If the owner has interest in redevelopment, to me, that's a lot easier to get over than maybe looking at all those factors that I had listed. So it's a balance between interest and availability. So. Oh, yep. Question was regarding site suitability and looking at the higher threshold for evidence needed for the site. So.
Hi, you mentioned that a lot of cities got higher numbers because of their proximity to transportation and jobs. Now, Pacifica is unique in that 60% of our land is dedicated open space. 30%, there is overlay, but 30% of it is also coastal commission subject to a density and height limit of no more than 35 feet. How do you accommodate some state and federal mandates, basically, right? That this is a federal parkland, that we can't build on it, but you're still giving us, the allocation. Was that taken into consideration? And the fact that the pandemic proved people do need recreation, because we were overwhelmed on Maury Point with the need for recreation.
So one thing that I can't answer is specific reasons why the Council of Government ABAG would have given Pacifica a certain number or not. I wasn't part of that conversation. But speaking to kind of how do you balance maybe coastal commission requirements and maybe not having an overabundance of land, to meet the targets. I think there's a couple different strategies. Some that I have seen jurisdictions, and I've worked on like Monterey area jurisdictions where I would say, coastal commission's still the factor there. We really try to balance out, requirements, and in our mind, when you're looking at density, it might be smaller units in those areas to meet the density instead of maybe some other spots in the state where the units might be a little bit bigger. So it's just, there's a lot of different ways to get to meeting coastal commission requirements, meeting our requirements for kind of sites. And so without going too into detail, I think there's just a lot of different ways that we can think about how to meet goals of one agency and our agency as well. But from what I've seen in other places, cities have been pretty proactive about, the constraints that they have and finding ways to mitigate those constraints. So I don't know if that specifically answers the question, but it's, oh, sorry.
As a follow-up to Mike's question about transportation, what I read is that so our allocations before were in the 300s, and now we're at almost 2,000, and a lot more with the buffers. Yeah, we don't have a lot of jobs here, so people are really commuting out. We don't have that many people commuting in either. So what I read is that they were looking at areas with a 30-minute drive to jobs and a 45-minute public transportation commute to jobs, which, I don't know, you can argue some of that, especially coming from down in Lindemore and, back of the valley. So, I'm not, and we're trying to put sites all over town, so even those more impacted by traffic now. But I guess what I'm having trouble is we're being forced to do all this. We already have transportation issues, lack of public transportation, which we can't get very easily because we don't have the demand, and lack of road infrastructure. So we're given this mandate, but where's the funding coming to help us improve those basic infrastructure and also sewage infrastructure and so forth that we don't have to build all these housing?
So I think I'll go back to that. Where was that slide? Sorry. I'll go back to this slide here. And part of the grant programs that we had was not just looking at rezoning and updating your housing element. Another eligible activity for these grants was to do a lot of the pre-planning for like sewer improvements, transportation improvements. That was part of these grants. So it wasn't just housing specific, it was kind of housing adjacent. So that was part of it. And I think the REAP grants, REAP 2.0, are more flexible in the sense that that funding source can actually do hard project instead of just the planning part, which was the component of, SB2 and LEAP was more planning, and I think REAP 2.0 is more implementation based. So that's where the funding, at least for, $600 million across the state's not going to make a huge dent. But in certain areas where applications are competitive, that would be one funding source to conduct kind of the surrounding infrastructure improvements.
So following on to that question, you mentioned that REAP 2.0 was a $600 million program, but it sounded as though you said it was more regionally focused. Would you consider, and I know you're probably not the ultimate expert, but a coastal region such as where Pacifica, our mid-coast, and then other jurisdictions like Half Moon Bay would qualify as a regional area that could perhaps look at some infrastructure challenges that we uniquely face on the coast?
So, unfortunately, that component, like the set asides for the different regions, that's already been decided. This REAP 2.0 really kicked off, I'd say, about a year and a half, 2 years ago. So I don't want to say the ship has sailed necessarily, and I know that there are other kind of, I think it's One Bay Area is another grant specific to the region. But that would be something where, advocacy around the issue would probably be more up there. The REAP 2.0 had specific set-asides for regions, but it didn't really look at coastal areas. I know that tribal had a separate set-aside, but we just didn't get the set-aside for coastal. If you push for it, keep us busy with these grant programs, that'd be nice. But that funding has kind of already been set. Projects have come in. We've already started the contract execution for a lot of the jurisdictions. So a little bit behind on that, but certainly I think good idea moving forward.
I used to be on the school board, and one of the biggest impacts, especially regarding infrastructure, would be the impact on schools, because you're probably going to increase population, and the disparity in funding of schools in terms of San Mateo County. There's one school district that's getting $28,000 per student, and then there's Pacifica that's getting $10,500 per student. Now, they can't afford a $10,500 to build the infrastructure, buildings and curriculum and everything else for schools. Is there going to be special funding from the state to increase that funding?
I just don't know. I mean, we're housing community development, and I know we're starting to trickle outside of housing when we're looking at funding for schools and the infrastructure to support that. As part of housing elements and housing development, and I'm sure it's the case here in Pacifica as well, impact fees are, a component of building new development, but I just cannot answer the question of specific funding for schools. That's kind of outside of what HCD's scope is.
When you're president, you have to kind of come up with questions. In case the room is silent, so anybody that wants to talk, please raise your hand. But the impact fees, on the other side, you're trying to limit the fees and lower the cost of development and building housing. So you have a oxymoron where you need more funding for schools to build not necessarily in Pacifica, but especially I would imagine in the Valley, impact of building more schools and everything else. But then you're saying the impact fee for building that needs to be lowered because it's a cost barrier for a developer. So it doesn't work. Well, that's one question. And another kind of a statement is, will the RENA numbers could they be revised so that it goes by bedrooms? Because otherwise you're encouraging senior housing or one bedroom or studio residences instead of family housing, which is 3 to 4 bedrooms, which would also then increase funding in a basic aid school district, because they're, not in a basic aid, but in a local LCAP funded school district, which is, Fanny's in the chair. So those are, I don't know if that's a question or if that's just rambling. Okay, but we do have a legit question over here from Pat.
All right, I can answer it. Yeah. We jumped around, so I don't know.
Kind of rambled, but,
I think part of the RENA numbers, to answer the second part, it's a mix of housing. So it's not just we're saying you have to build studio 1-bedroom apartments. I think another important part is a lot of these are based on the density. It's not necessarily the affordability of the unit. So I think that's where, you get a mix of housing. It doesn't always have to be the studio 1 bedrooms. It can be the larger, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms.
But the 1 bedroom counts as 1 unit, and a 3 bedroom would count as 1 unit.
Correct.
So to get more units, you could maybe fit 2 to 3 1-bedrooms and the space needed for a 3-bedroom.
Right.
So it benefits us, the city, to build 1-bedroom units.
You also have to consider, you were just talking about that lower income RHNA numbers. There's still the moderate and the above moderate, which doesn't have to be high density. Those are usually, most cities are going up to 10 dwelling units for the above moderate. Some cities go like 15 for moderate. So there's flexibility in how you achieve those units. It's not just you have to build small studios and that's the only thing you can build. But it's just how the density works out and how statute is written on RHNA. That's how that's crafted. Also, I wanted to respond to the first point. We don't look at and always say, when we review housing elements, we're not saying, reduce your fees, reduce your fees, reduce your fees. What we're asking is for an analysis of the constraint. So if you, as a city, analyze your fees, you talk to developers, you talk to whoever, and they decide, and there's a consensus that, the fees are not a constraint to development, then the fees don't have to be reduced. So I would like to maybe correct you on that first point, because it's not just the state saying you're wrong, the way that the city's doing it is incorrect. We do provide that flexibility. Granted, there are instances where, we do, after the analysis has kind of been conducted and, public input has been considered, that the fees are considered a constraint, but it's not just across the board. So I did want to correct that point.
Just as a member of the public, the SBs and the ABs run off your tongue very easily, but my specific question is, which legislative actions are the ones that really, where the rubber hits the road, really affect cities' abilities to govern their the development in their sites, in their cities? And maybe you could name 4 or 5. I don't, there seem to be, I wouldn't say hundreds, but there are a lot out there, and I'm not sure of precisely the ones that are most important. Like, transportation has one to do with it, and if you're making up new ordinances at the last minute, there's another one that has to do with that. If you could just review those most important ones.
It's kind of that's a tough one to answer, because even when we started the review of, let's say, the Bay Area jurisdictions, every new year we get new legislation. So I don't know, as far as, I can name like ADU law, like that's one that's pretty much updated every year. So consistency and updating that zoning ordinance is pretty important. I know, gosh, SB4, SB423, thank you for the reminder. Those are pretty new ones, and I think those have been strategies that cities have been using pretty recently. Gosh, I can, SB9 and SB10, 330, SB330, and then was it SB423 that just got signed, which is like SB35 in the coastal zone, I think. Don't quote me on that one, but those are like all kind of come into play. As far as its impact on sites, I feel like that's kind of a hard one to answer. If you're, as part of your housing element update and kind of programs and commitments that you make, we look to see, are you updating housing laws on a consistent basis? But as far as the ones that impact development directly, ADU law, SB9, SB10, SB4 is probably going to be a new one moving forward. So SB4 is that housing on religious sites or nonprofit housing, higher education institutions. So the list kind of goes on and on, but I'd kind of point to those. Sorry, I can repeat the question. You have that.
Okay, that should be easy.
Yeah.
I apologize if this is, given the level of discourse, if this is a really dumb question. And I also apologize if you said it at the beginning and I missed it. But you've used acronyms HCD and RHNA. What do they stand for?
Oh, yes. So the question is on acronyms, and you'd be surprised. We have a 5 or 6 page Word document internally of all the acronyms, and every time we hire someone new, the first question is, what is this? What is RENA? What is AB? What is COG? You know, HCD is the Department of Housing and Community Development. So that's the state agency that I work for. RENA is Regional Housing Needs Assessment. Allocation assessment. That goes both ways depending on where you're at. Yeah, that's why I tend not to say that one, because you can go either way. But those are those 2 acronyms.
Thank you.
Mhm.
What is COG?
COG is Council of Government. So ABAG is the Council of Government for this region, and they're basically kind of a conglomeration of local jurisdictions. They have a board. They're made up mostly of primarily of elected officials who make decisions kind of on a regional basis. So for this part here, they kind of provide the numbers to the individual jurisdictions, the allocation to the individual jurisdictions. Yes. You want me to repeat it? You know? Yeah. Okay.
Somebody behind you first.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
What percentage of the housing planned in cycles 1 through 5 was actually built?
The question is, what percentage of the housing need in the 1st through 5th cycles was actually built? I actually don't have that number, but from looking at housing elements, depending, like total, you know, there's always going to be that oversubscription of housing built for above moderate, which is going to be primarily, historically, is going to be your like single family homes. So think of like all the planned developments and all over the place. So that number's kind of skewing it. But if we just looked at low and lower income, I'd be hard pressed to say those numbers were above like 15 or 20%. So it's been a historically underserved as far as development. Yeah.
My question is, when you're taking the statewide housing need and allocating to regions, do you allocate to regions based on the perceived population needs, or do you allocate to regions based on the ability to build housing in that region?
So the number is the projection. So that would end. Oh, sorry. The question was, how are the housing allocations given to the Council of Governments, and whether that is a projection or a kind of a anticipated target or goal that cities can build. So RENA is a projection. So and I didn't put it up here because I didn't want to get too in the weeds, but it's basically a math formula. They look at, the Department of Finance looks at projected population, and they start looking at, you know, projected household incomes, and a couple different factors kind of knock that number down, and you ultimately get to the allocation given to the individual jurisdiction. Oh, I can pull it up. Let's see what we got here.
Well, Christine and then Christian said he wants to
Oh.
rebuttal.
I'll pull it up, but it's basically housings that got like demolished or in need of rehabilitation. That knocks the number down. I don't have internet here, so I can't pull it up quickly, but that's how those numbers are kind of crafted.
Is there ever any thought in terms of this is an area in the state where development for fresh housing makes sense, and therefore we should put more allocative numbers to that region simply because that's a place where we could actually build things that it makes sense to?
So the question is, if there's any opportunity, or you know, how can we essentially better the allocation to the individual jurisdictions? I think that's a conversation that's more up ABAG's alley than it is HCD's. They're the ones who provide the numbers to the individual jurisdictions, so that would probably be the opportunity to.
Sure, but I'm talking about before even the numbers are
yeah, again, this is how the projection is crafted. As far as the numbers, that's really a cog and regional thing. It's not something that we really look at. The way that HCD's involvement is on the allocation is just, does your methodology to assign to the jurisdictions based on transit or based on jobs or however that gets split up, does that meet statutory requirements? That's the level and extent of what we look at. We don't go kind of that extra layer of, like you had mentioned, like the feasibility is not part of the consideration. It's just not a statutory requirement.
My voice is wired. So I know statewide you were doing Southern California first, right? And Northern California is now in process. The deadline was this past January 31st. The deadline for all the rezoning and EIR work is coming up very quickly, the end of January. I'm curious how many municipalities in Northern California are compliant now. Do you think, most of them will be there by the end of January? And what is your similar experience with Southern California? Are there still jurisdictions working towards compliance? And what have you seen as the sticks, I guess, the repercussions of not having an adopted housing element by the deadline?
Sorry, I'm going to get my internet set up because that's going to be the best way I can answer this question.
Was the Pacifica?
You're welcome to connect to my phone if you want to. Would you have it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, though.
Mike, do you want me to maybe fill in now with my piece, and then we can come back to Jose? Sorry about that. Technology we have. Well, good morning, everybody. For those that didn't hear the introduction earlier, my name is Christian Murdock. I'm the planning director for the city of Pacifica. I want to thank Jose for coming down on behalf of the city staff. We really appreciate his time on the weekend to come and share his insights and expertise as a member of HCD. I agree with everything he said, and I think he brought some helpful information. What I'm hoping to do today is share some local perspective from a local jurisdiction, the city of Pacifica, in our experience so far in this 6th cycle housing element update process. I've worked for the city of Pacifica for 9 years, which means I was here through the RENA 5 cycle housing element update process and have been leading the update process for RENA 6. And so I had a feel and a flavor for how it was before as well as how it's going right now. And so I'm happy to answer any questions about that today as well. I do also want to first assure you that Jose and I did not coordinate on our responses today, but I found it interesting that he touched on a lot of the same subject matter that I thought was important to set the local context. And first, I want to hit on some positives from my perspective that Jose mentioned as well. HCD's staff has been very helpful throughout our ongoing housing element update process. They've been available whenever we've reached out with questions. They've met with us multiple times. A team that's involved in reviewing our housing element has traveled to Pacifica, which really gave me the opportunity to show them what I'm seeing in the community in terms of our opportunities, our challenges, and the ways that we're thinking through how to overcome those challenges in terms of sites, the overall magnitude of the planning challenge, and so forth. And I think that really helped give them some insight and perspective when our draft housing element went to them for the first review. So I'm grateful for their time having done that. I also do want to also acknowledge that the state has been generous with funding for our planning efforts. We'd have been hard pressed, I think, to find the resources that we've been able to rely on from the state if we would have had to come up with all of that money locally. So thank you to HCD and to the state for that. Shifting gears to the overall RENA, throughout this housing element update process, I've heard a lot of community feedback that it's just not fair, that the state has dumped all these units onto Pacifica. And I want to maybe offer a different perspective on that. As Jose outlined, that process is from the state to our regional planning and governing body, ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments. And that final decision-making process is led by our local Bay Area elected officials who are on the ABAG governing board. And so to the extent that we're unhappy with the allocation that Pacifica received, it's really a more local problem than just pointing to the state and blaming them. The framework and the criteria to prioritize where those units would go in the region was crafted by the ABAG staff and endorsed by the ABAG board. And so, you know, to the extent that we think more housing units should have gone elsewhere, we may need to think about how to constructively engage in that prioritization process for the next housing element cycle. With that said, I think that the process was well-intentioned. Certainly there has been an emphasis on trying to consider social justice, environmental justice, equity in the housing planning process and the allocation of units on a regional basis. And so things like clean environment, safe community, good schools, and access to opportunity were really strong prioritization mechanisms in that allocation process. And I think we all agree Pacifica has all of those, right? And that's what makes this a great community to live in. It's given you and your children and your families access to opportunity to thrive. And that's why this process has found Pacifica as a great place for more people to live, right? To have access to those same opportunities. There are certainly practical challenges to accommodating that type of growth, especially over an 8-year horizon. But I think if you just step back and try to look objectively, there's some rationality to that process. And we just have our work cut out for us as far as how to welcome, you know, that type of growth and those people into our community. In terms of the timeline, this is where I maybe shift to where we're having some particular challenges. So the timeline is very challenging to accomplish the housing element update. There's no doubting that. The final RENA allocation was approved and assigned in December of 2021. And the statutory deadline for our region to complete the housing element update is the end of January of 2023. And so it's a sprint from the time you know what your final allocation is to when you have to have that housing element update completed and the consequences begin to accrue. That 13-month process, if you will, if you're not doing anything else, it'll be tough, but it's doable. But it doesn't take into account all of the other real world factors, right? Other political or community priorities, the general plan update that we had, the COVID pandemic, the Great Resignation, which impacted our planning department significantly. And so all of these things that can really cause churn and difficulty under the best of circumstances, really make this almost an impossible task to get done within the allowable timeline. And so I can't say that I, blame the state for that process, but certainly the legislative timelines and the way that that's come out in state law has made it a difficult job even more difficult. And then in terms of sites, I think this RENA cycle certainly, as Jose mentioned, there's been more statutory criteria in state law as well as more HCD staff scrutiny and requirement for analysis and evidence related to sites. Overall, I think it's probably the right policy approach, certainly on a statewide basis. There are well-intentioned requirements in state law about the use of non-vacant sites for lower income housing in particular. And I think, the thought process reasonably is that if, there's an existing building or some use there, it may or may not be discontinued to allow housing, or it may add to the costs of that site redeveloping. And building affordable housing is already very challenging from a financial perspective. But what I think it does also is it assumes that cities, are placing low-income housing sites intentionally on, bad sites, if we'll call them that. And that may be the case, statewide, and it may be a fair criticism, but it's certainly not the case in Pacifica, in RENA 5 and RENA 6. The challenge for a city like Pacifica, from my perspective, is that, as Mike mentioned, nearly half our land is permanently preserved, publicly owned open space. More than that, pushing 50% when you add in private, permanent dedication in terms of open space easements and so forth. So, whoever was doing the allocation, sort of looking maybe not at fine enough detail about the capacity and the ability to integrate housing at the magnitude that's been assigned to us. And so, what remains is essentially, in a community like ours that's mostly built out, is there's some postage stamp sized vacant sites, right, that check a lot of the boxes for HCD, but they're so small, they're not really going to yield the numbers of units that we need. Or you have some very steep hillside sites, right, that probably shouldn't be developed, or at least not with a lot of housing units at the densities that would be required. So, given our unique built condition and history of development and topography, it's particularly challenging, and it's not really clear where that's accounted for in this process. So we're left, with those well-intentioned criteria to justify our sites, as if there was some alternative to those sites in the first instance. And so, fortunately, thus far in the process, HCD has been generally receptive of our approach to sites, and so I'm grateful for that. But, if you were to look at the letter of the law, we're going to be hard-pressed in some cases to justify these non-vacant sites. And as I mentioned, there's really no place else to put the housing here. And so it would be good if there was some way to get recognition of that and to say, okay, well, you're doing the best that you can. What other factors can we address, like increasing density or, reducing the processing timeline or what have you? So those are my observations on some of the practical challenges for this sixth cycle. And I did just want to, maybe circle back to the question from Pat Kramer and leave this impression. The question that she had asked was, what's the state law or handful of state laws that are really going to result in housing being built here in Pacifica? To me, that's asking the wrong question. I think from my experience and perspective, it's the local political and decision maker climate and the community climate for accepting housing and being willing to approve it and trying to put the work in to figure out where should housing go so we can all get behind it. And I think, if we were to point to a state law, it's the California Environmental Quality Act that time and again comes up as a tool for people who use it or misuse it, depending on your perspective. Whatever characterization you give to it, people can use that to pick at any minuscule detail of a review of a housing project in a way that causes that timeline to get dragged out, to result in litigation. And some people intentionally use it to cause folks to give up, developers to give up on their housing projects. And so that's a state law that I think is, again, well-intentioned, but it's a mixed record in terms of how it relates to addressing some of our other needs, including our major task for planning for housing. So thank you.
So I will jump back to the earlier question, and this is on HCD's website, Housing Element Compliance Report. I refer to this almost every day, just looking at who's in, who's out. The numbers here show that out of the 109 Bay Area jurisdictions, 48 are currently in compliance. One has not submitted a draft yet. I don't think so. And then 60 are kind of in that process whether they've received at least one letter from HCD listing out, needed revisions and how they could comply. So we're 44%. So I'd say compared to, I'd say compared to other regions in the state. So if I look at Southern California, when they, let's see if I can make this work. It would have been October of last year. So out of, I think, 197, I think maybe only 81 were in compliance by that 1 year, 1 year out from the deadline. So, yes. And then Sandag's like 19 jurisdictions, which is the San Diego region, and we were maybe at about half at that 1 year mark. So I think making better strides in the Bay Area than maybe some of the other regions. Just from kind of anecdotally, there's a lot of jurisdictions in the Bay Area that are a couple things away from being found in compliance. And that's pretty much a theme. Most of the jurisdictions in the Bay Area submitted their housing elements early on in the process, which was not the case in Southern California and in the San Diego region. So kudos to Bay Area planning staff for getting those in early, on time, and that's why you'll see those numbers reflect more favorably in the Bay Area.
Any repercussions for non-compliance in Southern California?
Well, now that they are 2021, so we're 2 years into their planning period. That's where the accountability and enforcement team has started to look at these individual cities, and what they do is call out non-compliance with housing element law, and so they were starting to get, hey, letters that say, hey, you haven't completed your housing element, what's the status of it? And then those letters, and that process is a lot more, I want to say, legal than it is kind of planning, where now it's HCD and the Attorney General office, sending strongly worded letters that say, hey, you're not in compliance. What are the steps to get into compliance? If not, then potential for the negative actions, legal actions.
And just to follow up, they're susceptible to builders remedy applications, to lawsuits, too. Are you tracking any of that?
Yeah, so when I talked about the land use and local government relations unit, there's like 3 little branches in it. So I'm in the land use planning grants and incentives. So we do primarily like the REAP, the LEAP, and then we have 2 accountability and enforcement units. One is a proactive, so they're the ones who are reaching out to the cities and saying, hey, the deadline for getting your housing element in compliance has passed. What's the status? Can you give us an update? Depending on what that answer is from the jurisdiction, that's kind of a 2-path. Either we stay in the planning path, or we move to kind of a letter saying we need to get this kind of formal process for you getting into compliance. And then that 3rd unit is more of the reactive. So that would be the unit that looks at kind of planning commission, zoning board, city council, board of supervisor decisions or actions or inactions on housing projects. So, for instance, if a housing development meets all the requirements, all the objective standards, but it gets disapproved by a city council, that's where our reactive planning or accountability unit would reach out and kind of investigate that case and make sure that the denial was, counter to what it should have been. Yes.
Given the rise in interest rates and slowdown in construction, is that having any impact on the programs, or is that not something that's considered?
So the question was higher interest rates, higher construction costs, is that having an impact on any of the programs? That falls into kind of the non-governmental constraint section, which is outside of what most cities can control. The cost of land, interest rates, availability of financing, that's stuff that the cities really don't have any control over. I imagine on the grand scale that it definitely is impacting, but to the extent that it impacts the housing element, I just can't point to anything in particular.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thanks for being here, Jose. This is going to be a difficult question for you, but I want you to shift and just pretend that you're predicting the future and you're actually the governor in the future.
Oh. What's funny is our communication staff told me, do not answer any questions that make you on behalf of the administration. So I will preface it with that.
I'll create the hypothetical anyways, and you can choose to ignore it if you want to not answer it. But really, going back to the point that building housing is an economic affair that cities don't control.
Right.
And the finances are very complex in that. What do you think HCD is going to do when we're winding up this housing cycle, and across the state there's nowhere near the construction of housing that all the cities worked really hard to plan for, but the economic forces just didn't get us there?
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good question. I will not. Oh, sorry. The question is, once we start wrapping up kind of the 6th cycle, what considerations HCD might have kind of moving forward in kind of maybe the development of the numbers to kind of the council, the governments, and kind of just moving kind of into the 7th cycle. That's probably one that I cannot answer. I know that one thing that was, and if we had this conversation maybe a couple months ago, was an effort that HCD did have called the RENA Reform, which I don't know if you all had heard about that, but it basically was workshops that HCD held looking at changes to the 7th cycle RENA. So that was really a forum, and I think the deadline for that, like, the conversations closed. It was more something that happened during the summer. But I know that our team did look at and held stakeholders like the Council of Governments, community-based organizations. We had educational institutions really provide input moving into the 7th cycle, what changes could be implemented or should be implemented. So I don't know if I can answer your question specifically, but I do know that that was something that did happen. We did have that, and that was, again, statutorily required for us to kind of gather stakeholders and look at the 7th cycle. So I'm sure input similar to what you had just said was provided there. I just don't know the response. I think July 31st, there was a deadline to kind of report to the legislature, and I believe there might be a follow-up requirement for HCD staff to reach out to the legislature with kind of a more robust set of findings from those conversations. So probably stay tuned for the end of the year. But that conversation has happened. I just wasn't part of that team.
Any other comments? I'm going to close the meeting. I know you'll all be disappointed. You know? Well, everybody, I want to thank Jose coming all the way down to Sacramento. Thank you, Jose. You know, and we'll tell your boss you didn't speak for the administration. Okay. Give me his name and number or her name and number when you do it. Okay. Thank you, Christian, for coming, and also. And Kevin's already left, but thank you for coming and giving a Pacifica perspective. And I adjourn the meeting unless anybody else has another comment. Thank you.